That's the only exit. What are you going to do next?
Wake up, Artyom, wake up!
Great, he's coming to. Put the light away, you're blinding him.
Okay, let's do a summary of what the video series has shown. Ethnic self-segregation. Races self-segregate in many ways in society, such as in schools or neighborhoods, voting records, etc. This is observable at a very early age and doesn't stop in late adulthood, and is observable cross-culturally and internationally around the globe. The biggest study on diversity. The biggest study made on diversity showed that individuals in diverse neighborhoods have fewer friends, trust their neighbors less, are less generous, and spend more time inside their homes. The reverse is observed in homogeneous neighborhoods. Behavior of children. Children prefer to befriend people of their own race, like their own race more, and understand that race is immutable and persistent, unlike body type and occupation. Children think gender is subordinated race, as the majority of children, when told to group people, group them based on race and not gender. Welfare, ethnicity, and altruism. People are willing to be more altruistic, show more solidarity, and be more generous in homogeneous neighborhoods and nations than in diverse neighborhoods and nations, which is observable cross-culturally and internationally. Ethnic warfare and ethnic nepotism. The vast majority of war and conflicts are based in ethnic roots. The most peaceful states in America are the most homogeneous ones, whilst the least peaceful states were the more diverse ones. Diverse prisons have race gangs, race riots, and are segregated by race. Since the prison is a microcosmos for our own society, race riots, as in prisons, can easily, as it has throughout history, spark out into a full-blown race war. Racism in history and anthropology. Racism has been practiced and been observable since the beginning of recorded human history. It can be read in everything from the Vedas to Egyptian racial categorization and their national exclusion of peoples based on race, etc. On the genetic level, there has been little mixing between populations. Human history is one of categorizations, exclusions, and genocides. Marriage and dating studies. People prefer to have a partner of their own race, are a lot more willing to date people of their own race, are willing to wait longer and pay more money to get a child of their own race. Transracially adopted children are more likely to commit suicide, are more likely to seek out their biological parents, and likewise, biracial marriages end up in divorce earlier, has a higher rate of domestic violence, all which is in accordance with the Cinderella effect and the theory of genetic similarity. Genetic similarity theory and theory of altruism. There's evolutionary reasons why racism would be inherited and natural. It does make mathematical and evolutionary sense. There are several other types of evidence that supports the theory of genetic similarity, which in essence says that the more closely related we are to individuals or groups, the more altruistic we are, and the less suspicious and hostile are we. This has an inverse effect to genetically distant individuals or groups. Racism is recognized as egoism, narcissism by psychologists, and social scientists recognize that ethnic pride boosts individuals' confidence and performance. Racism, not speciesism, by animals. Racism is observable among other species to whom we share ancestry with. Racism is observable among our closest related species, the chimpanzee, and this emerged in infancy without influence by their peers or parents. Scientists believe this is the origin of our own racism. Some scientists go even further back and point to our shared ancestor with bacteria. Behavior of babies and toddlers. Babies free from influence in their lack of consciousness at 3 months of age recognize race and categorize them, where the baby favored the race he perceives is the same as his parents, and therefore his own. This while he doesn't stop there but also is xenophobic towards and suspicious of and dislike other races. Hormones, MRI scans, and IAT. There's an implicit-explicit racial attitude gap between the subconscious and conscious mind, between consciously self-subscribed anti-racists. This phenomenon was observable cross-culturally and was discovered in adult-like levels in young children. There have been actual hormones discovered that give rise to racism, see oxytocin. There have been actual racial recognition and racial stereotyping genes discovered in chromosome 7. The amygdala responds more to people of other races, and fears are greater and persist longer with people of other races than people of one's own race. Scientists also believe one of its origins lies in the mirror neuron system. I'll let you be the judge whether or not racism is natural or not, but the evidence is for me very satisfying, and I will personally say that the evidence clearly show that yes, racism is natural. My only question to you now is, converted? Did I manage to convince you that my thesis was correct? Now, before answering that question, I'd first like to point out that during the 5-month display of this series, I've mainly gotten 2 criticisms, and I'd like to shortly address both of them here towards the end of the series. One deals with the definitions, and it's a criticism of me using the word racism a bit broadly. They go by the old definition, which used to define racism and stated that racism was hating an individual of another race because he is of another race, and believing one race is objectively superior to another. The old definition of racism didn't use to include such behavioral traits as racial prejudice, racial ethnocentrism, racial categorizations, racial preference, racial discrimination, and racial self-segregation in the word and concept of racism. Whilst I did, this was what I shown was to be natural. However, my argument is that dictionaries change. The way the old dictionary defined the word racism no longer corresponds to the way the word is used in everyday life, in media, by the legal system, or by private persons today. I use the word accurately and in accordance with the way it is being used and thought of today in the contemporary society. I don't necessarily like that the word has changed, but my ideological opponents has changed it, and I don't see it changing back to its original definition anytime soon. I think that train is past. Another critique is that the word natural is too vague of a definition to have any meaning to it. My argument is that I did define what I meant by natural more narrowly in the introductory video. A quick run through. By racism being natural, I meant and shown that it is biological, genetic, freely emerging, without outside interference, something that supersedes conscious thought and ideas, something that is less needed to be shaped by culture for its manifestation, a biological predisposition, more hardwired, etc. I have a problem with the critics who attempt to make racism being natural analogies to murders being natural or rape or genocide being natural. It's a false analogy. They're not analogous. It's not the same thing. There is nothing inherently evil about racism as explained in the introductory video. Whilst both murder, rape and genocide all are aggressive actions on non-consenting involuntary participants, racism can be confined to mere opinions or desires of physical disassociation by a pleading of being left alone. Racism, unlike murder, genocide, and rape, is not an inherent initiation of force. It can be, but doesn't have to be. Thus they're not analogous. So what have I shown is natural? I've shown that it is not anti-racism we will regress towards once cultural ideas had let go of our previously shackled minds. It is instead racism and all of its forms and manifestations that we will regress towards. Because it is our biological inclination, and it can take explicit or implicit forms. And unlike the previous analogy I made in the introductory video where I likened it to sex, unlike the urge for sex or sometimes murder, implicit racism has greater social consequences than does implicit attraction for females or temporary anger specifically aimed and directed towards a particular person. And again, implicit racism is a suppressed type of racism, like socially constraining oneself and not humping on every attractive girl one comes across. The difference being that suppressed racism have far greater social consequences. Going back to some statements in the introductory video, evidently racism is natural, hardwired, biological, and will emerge on its own for most people, and that means that it is the anti-racists and not the racists that has been brainwashed by cultural ideas. Since anti-racism isn't our biological predisposition, and there's an implicit-explicit racial attitude gap amongst those who have been brainwashed. I've read comments saying that racism can be suppressed or inflamed by culture, and yes, indeed it can. However, some have even went as far as to claim that it is some vague abstract elite that has brainwashed people to become more racist than their genes otherwise would allow. Inflaming racism via culture, essentially. However, this is much more falsifiable and contradicting to the evidence than me saying that we have been brainwashed by a vague abstract elite to suppress racism, seeing how unmalleable racism is and how early babies and children will self-segregate themselves racially and even linguistically. Groups who naturally self-segregate will automatically form different cultures and desires, and thus poor whites and poor blacks won't have more in common with each other as this person claimed, as they evidently possess and will possess two different subcultures which they desire to be advanced. Likewise, you don't see working class minorities caring about expanding affirmative action to include working class whites. You in fact observe the opposite. They're fighting with claws for the exclusive right for their particular minority group to get social and economic advancements at the expense of working class whites and other minorities. Hence the hundreds of race-specific civil rights organizations and associations attempting to argue who is the biggest victim and thus should reap the biggest reward. More inherent and implicit is that they have different evolutionary paths to take and share different genetic interests, as evolution is based on ancestral divergence and genetic similarity theory has explained why different economic classes saw beyond class and rather united with other classes of the same race in their homogeneous nations post-1950 in Europe and the world, rather than to globally unite with people of the same economic class but of different nationalities, cultures, and races. Likewise, we also know that IQ has a tie to income, and that IQ regressed to the aggregate of gene pools and populations. This is called regression to the mean. That is to say, rich people with a high IQ will create descendants who regress towards the mean and have a lower IQ and a lower income. Likewise, poor people with a low IQ will create descendants who regress towards the mean and have a higher IQ and a higher income. So these positions are not permanent and are generationally temporary. As Lawrence Hirschfeld's study shows, even young children understands that a person's occupational level won't last forever and can be changed, but that race certainly will last a whole lifetime. You were born into a race and will, whether you like it or not, die being part of a race. So what purpose does racism serve other than it being pre-rational? Well, it serves the integrity of gene pools, the advancement of gene pools, the divergence of species into subspecies, and eventually species. It serves evolution, as evolution works on the basis of separating ancestral groups. Racism protects integrity and further divergence and thus evolution.